Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Bambry, and I serve as the Vice President for Alumni and Student Engagement at your University of Illinois Alumni Association. I first want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, as we are looking forward to another great session of our ongoing Alumni College Speaker Series. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to take just a moment to talk about some amazing things happening at the Alumni Association. In the past few months, the association has relaunched its paid membership model with some great new benefits. We are excited to bring this to our alumni, and I would encourage you to visit uiaa.org/membership for details about what all is included and also to go ahead and sign up. Some of these expanded benefits include a partnership with the Krannert Center for the Performing Arts that will feature 2 member-only virtual performances each year, a chance to engage in career coaching, and discounts at the university bookstore, to name a few. For those of you on the call who may be life members of the association, you are in a wonderful spot, as you will be able to access these benefits today at no additional cost. We are certainly grateful for the investment you have made in your life membership, and will honor that with this current suite of benefits. While we have introduced this paid membership model for those interested in our expanded benefits and offerings, we are also still planning to have a lot of ways to engage with us at no cost. For example, the speaker series this evening will continue to be for all alumni, and other initiatives like our online networking and mentorship platform, Alumni Link, will also continue as a no-cost benefit. If you haven't already checked out Alumni Link, please do so by visiting alumnilink.illinois.edu. We're quickly approaching over 8,000 individuals, alumni and students on that platform who have already signed up, and it is a great way to interact with those folks. Lastly, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I always like to remind everyone to please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We've left a good bit of time at the end for questions in the Q&A that Nicholas and myself will take part in, and we'll certainly get through as many of those questions as time allows. But let's get to why we are all here this evening, and that is to hear from one of our wonderful faculty members here at Illinois. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Nicholas Grossman is a teaching assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. His research interests include asymmetric warfare, terrorism, insurgency, guerrilla warfare, etc., drones and other robotic systems, international relations, and national and international security policy. In 2018, he published Drones and Terrorism, Asymmetric Warfare, and the Threat to Global Securities. He holds a BA from Wesleyan University and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Maryland. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicholas Grossman. Dr. Grossman, thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and the floor is yours.
Hi, so thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. I am going to give you an overview of some things about the conflict that I think are important, but I am going to leave a lot of time for questions. I think probably some of you have different questions, different interests on this, and I am happy to take it just about any direction you like. I have been, I'd say, near obsessed with this war since it broke out. I'm following it almost day to day, kind of like it's maybe a political campaign or a sports league or something like that. And I'm happy to talk about whichever parts you want. So here we go. Okay, so one thing just to put it in perspective is this is a really big war. As much as it has captured a lot of international attention or domestic attention in the United States and places around the world, I don't think people have quite wrapped their brain around just how big it is. So we are witnessing the biggest state military operation since the US-led invasion of Iraq. That was in 2003, almost 20 years ago. This is the first attempted war of conquest since Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. By that, I mean that the first one in which the war aims were clearly about gaining territory or gaining control of something permanently. So there is no equivalent, for example, with Russia and Ukraine with the Iraq war of saying that they will set up a government and hold elections, and then if the government asks them to leave, will, as the United States did in 2011 in Iraq. Currently, In the current offensives, it is probably, and I don't know this for certain because coverage of military battles, real-time coverage will be very spotty. It'd be too dangerous to go close. But I'm pretty sure that right now what's going on are the largest tank and artillery battles since World War II, anywhere in the world, not just specifically in Europe. The casualties from the war are hard to know. Different people say different things. Russia, of course, has an incentive to downplay Russian deaths. Ukraine has an incentive to play up Russian deaths and also play up Ukrainian civilian deaths. So it's hard to know the exact numbers, but reading between the lines of what Ukraine says and Russia says and the UN says and the Pentagon says, it is likely that tens of thousands of people have been killed on either side, that Russian killed in action is almost certainly above 10,000 and might be as high as 15, with also injured that are no longer able to fight anymore, another perhaps 10,000, and that Ukrainian casualties are likely as large or larger. Over 10 million people have been forced to flee Ukraine, which is the fastest population displacement that we have seen anywhere since World War II. To put that in perspective, about 11 million people have been forced to flee Syria from the Syrian civil war, but that is also a smaller country, about half the size of Ukraine, so it is a larger percentage of the population, but that displacement took place over 10 years. The one in Ukraine has taken place in just 2 months. And all of these things will have long-term implications that we won't really be able to understand until the war is over. In terms of the conflict itself, there are a variety of causes. One that you may have heard talked about is NATO expansion, something that after the Cold War, the United States and NATO allies considered whether they would either dissolve NATO once the Soviet Union was gone, if they would keep it, but keep it the same, or if they would expand it. And they decided to allow in additional members, countries that were applying to be in NATO, but of course NATO could have said yes or no. So this included a variety of former Soviet states, such as Poland, Romania, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and all of them joined, and Russia would not unreasonably perceive that as potentially threatening. The US also had held out the possibility of Ukrainian membership, but it wasn't something that was about to happen or looked like it was happening anytime soon. But still, it's not unreasonable for Russia to have seen this as potentially threatening. It is, however, I think a big stretch to say that NATO expansion is the specific cause of this conflict. Why kill Ukrainians now? How would that, say, counter the NATO expansion, or what move would do it? A probably better way to understand the conflict with NATO as a background, but to understand the direct cause, is the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution, which was in 2014. That ousted a pro-Russia Ukrainian president who was also impeached and refusing to leave, and big protests, some of which turned violent, got him to flee. He fled to Moscow, and Ukraine has had subsequent elections and elected leaders that are more pro-West, more pro-EU, and that this has been a problem for Russia, something that the Russian government really doesn't like, not only because they lost what amounted to a client in Ukraine, but also Ukraine has done decently better since they have been more friendly with the EU. Their economy is better, and democracy has been serving them quite well, which is something that the Putin government, because it is an alternative example of what they are not providing. Starting back in 2014, after the Maidan Revolution, was when Russia took Crimea and starting fomenting war in the Donbas region, which are the easternmost provinces of Ukraine. And that war has been going on and off for about 8 years. So we're not seeing a brand new war so much as a really big escalation of a long simmering one. Also, when we look at what the Russian government says, in particular, what Putin has said, it's interesting in that they barely mention NATO. Putin gave a speech at the start of war in which he argued things like Ukraine isn't a real country. It's really part of Russia. It should never have independence, that it shouldn't have even had independence in the first place. And that really doesn't sound like somebody who just has some geopolitical concerns, some normal security concerns that they need to address. Russia's also tried at various times lying about its cause for war. Sometimes these get to be pretty ridiculous. It claimed that there was a Ukrainian caused genocide in Donbas, and those genocides are things that leave a lot of evidence, and there wasn't any. They claimed at times that there were US-backed bioweapons labs that designed some pathogen that targeted only Russian DNA and had sent it into Russia via birds. I am not making that up. The Russian government made that up. and a variety of other things that show kind of a shifting attempt to justify the war, which indicates to me that most likely it is the idea of a war of conquest, but where Russia wants to, and Putin in particular, wants to take control of Ukraine, or at least wanted to at the start of it. So Russia's aim in the beginning was pretty clearly regime change. They demanded that the government, the current government under Ukrainian President Zelensky, abdicate, and that they had, according to UK and US intelligence, plans to install another pro-Russian puppet. But also their military operations were clearly aimed at regime change, in that Russia rushed into the country with multiple lines of attack and went to try to surround Kyiv, the capital. I think from observing this, that most likely what Russia's hope was that they were going to rush into the country and that Ukraine would collapse, that under the pressure, either the government would quit or the military would fall apart, and that Russia would have a fairly easy time of it, and then also get ahead of any international reaction, ahead of any sanctions. So with the seizure of Crimea in 2014, Russia was able to do it very fast in a day or two, and almost entirely bloodless. That they showed up, and they showed up at a bunch of guys with guns who did not admit where they were from, but everybody knew where they were from, showed up at places like police stations and government offices and took it over. And then when the world complained about it, there were a few sanctions, but it wasn't really a strong reaction. And granted, a stronger reaction now is in part due to that legacy of Crimea, but also it is an indication that perhaps the Putin government underestimated what the Western reaction would be, and especially underestimated what the Ukrainian resolve would be. So Russia had some pretty poor military execution. And I mean that surprised me and a lot of military analysts. Some really basic stuff that they haven't pulled off or that they're doing poorly. For example, they still to this date have not established air superiority. They don't control the skies. That's the sort of thing that the United States military would not, unless it was really desperate, would not send in ground forces unless it controlled the skies first. Russia has had poor logistics, meaning that there have been a number of vehicles that have run out of fuel and then are just sort of stuck and sitting ducks. They invaded Ukraine during what's known as mud season and evidently have a lot of really poor tires, and that has also caused problems with vehicles. So these are pretty basic things, and the Russian military has proven to be good at pretty much one thing, which is firing indiscriminately into civilian areas, and has not been especially good at a lot of the other elements of military execution. And this meant that their offensive got bogged down. It did not capture any major city and is still attempting to capture Mariupol, which is in the east and on the Black Sea. And that one looks like they may have it, but that is a far cry from being able to storm through the country and having cities surrender to them as they seem to have originally intended. And so now they've shifted to a population punishment strategy, which is if you look at past Russian actions, is kind of the Russian way of war, that in the late 1990s, Russia fought a war in Chechnya and leveled the city of Grozny. And starting in 2015, Russia intervened in Syria on behalf of the government of Bashar al-Assad against various rebel groups, and Russian and Syrian forces leveled the city of Aleppo. And so leveling cities like Mariupol and firing into a lot of civilian areas, trying to impose enough punishments until the people that are fighting them quit, is a standard part of Russian military practice. But so to their evident surprise, Ukraine held together. It got a lot of international support. The West in particular reacted very strongly. And Ukraine pretty recently won the Battle of Kyiv, in that they were able to stop Russia from trying to encircle the capital and then push Russian forces back from that area. That was some of the areas around Kyiv, like the city of Bucha, or town maybe of Bucha, that was one of the locations where some Russian war crimes have been discovered afterwards. Things like mass graves and evidence of rapes and torture and things along those lines. So Ukraine has now pushed Russia back, and Russia is refocusing on the Donbas in the area. So that's in the east, and where they are trying to, this is a scale back of their war aims, but to potentially take that over. And whether they can or not is an open question. I don't know. We will have to see what happens on the ground. For those of you that are sports fans, it's like the sports cliche of that's why they play the games. to see what the results are. This is an ambiguous thing where we don't know, but I'm pretty confident that the current battle of Donbas going on now will, in a large part, shape what the final settlement is, whatever that ends up being. Here's a look at some maps of the conflict. This is one that I like the map style here because if you notice there are kind of those red splotches and lines. There's some maps that would show all of that in control of red, and Russia does not control all that territory. The gray area is contested or maybe rural, sparsely populated. Russia controls some of the roads and had made inroads into various parts of Ukraine, but had not able to take over more than smaller towns, none major cities. But so this is a map from March 22nd. And to give you an idea of how much when I say that Ukraine pushed Russia back, this is where it is now a month later. So I'm just kind of back and forth once more. That's where it was in March, about at the advance, high point of Russia's advance. And this is where it is now. So Russia has largely abandoned its northern offensive and kept up in the south out of Crimea and in the east of Donbas, which is where the focus of the war is now. But what this means is that Ukraine, by military victories, has secured its independence. It will likely survive as an independent nation, which was a lot of military analysts doubted that Ukraine would be able to survive. What this also means, though, is that fears about a prolonged insurgency where Russia does manage to take over Ukraine, but then there are a variety of fighters that continue to oppose the Russian occupation and are perhaps staged in places like Poland and Romania across the border, which would have created greater security dangers of a wider war. Those have largely been abated because of, first, Kyiv being able to stand, and second, of the deterrence between NATO and Russia has held. That as much as the United States and other countries have helped the Ukrainians, they have avoided doing any sort of direct attacks on Russian forces. And for example, a no-fly zone that some have called for, a no-fly zone is a we shoot down their planes zone. And when the United States does it, it's a we blow up their radar and anti-air defenses on the ground before we try zone. And to do that would involve American forces directly attacking Russian military targets, and that risks escalation that could land into World War III, potentially even a nuclear exchange. Russia also has hit a variety of targets in Ukraine, has hit some near the city of Lviv in the west, which is near where some of the weapon staging areas are, but they have not done anything across the border. So far at least, the deterrence that kept the Cold War cold has also held in this case. The international reaction has also been massive and in some ways is unprecedented. At the start, the United States tried to deter Russia, one with a novel technique called deterrence by disclosure, in which the US publicized a lot of intelligence about what Russia was doing, where usually intelligence agencies tend to keep secrets. And this time where both US President Joe Biden and a variety of American officials and also some British, some Germans, and other European intelligence agencies disclosed information, a lot of which turned out to be quite prescient. And in an attempt to try to say, oh, hey, don't believe Russia's claims that it's not planning war, here they are, and here are their plans. And that did not deter Russia, nor did the threats to impose sanctions or help Ukraine. And then Russia invaded anyway. Afterwards, NATO has been supporting Ukraine by openly sending a variety of weapons, some of them pretty advanced. And that is different. The degree to which, not the sending of weapons, but the degree to which they're being really open about it. So in the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union and China helped the North Vietnamese against America. And in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, the United States and Pakistan helped the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. And in the Iraq War, Iran helped arm the Iraqi insurgents, but none of them were being really open about it. They're always trying to at least do what intelligence agencies call plausible deniability, to be able to at least say that they weren't doing it and not have somebody prove it. Whereas in this case, we see a bunch of countries jumping up and down about how they're the ones that are sending the weapons that are killing Russian soldiers. There's some risk with that, but at least so far, the deterrence is held. The United States in particular and NATO in general have been adamant that they are not deploying their own forces. Again, that's out of concern of escalation. And one thing just to caution people of where I've heard the argument that oh, Russia doesn't want a wider war, or, Putin won't use nuclear weapons because he knows that then he would get a nuclear strike in return. And that part is true, but the reason why I would caution people is a lot of times this stuff can take on a mind of its own. Of escalation can get out of control, and things can get out of control very quickly. The concern with nuclear weapons is not so much that Putin would decide that he can win a nuclear war, or perhaps that he gets so desperate that he thinks he needs to use it. That's very unlikely. I mean, I wouldn't say zero chance, but very unlikely. But the bigger risk are things like accidents and miscalculation and misreading radar and thinking there's a launch, or a variety of other actions that could lead things to spiral very quickly. And so we don't want to get close to that if we can help it. In addition to giving weapons, there is likely a pretty large degree of US and Western intelligence support for Ukraine, and probably some cyber activity behind the scenes as well. That one of the things analysts are curious about is many expected a larger cyber component to the war. And one of the best explanations I've heard for why that isn't the case is not so much because it isn't happening, but because the United States in particular, and think in this case, the NSA and the Military Cyber Command anticipated a lot of this. And there are reports that they spent the last few months before the war removing various Russian malware from computers around the world. So that might be part of the explanation that we haven't seen that much cyber because it's being countered. The economic punishment against Russia and the diplomatic isolation, however, is massive and unprecedented. When I say unprecedented, I mean that literally. We, meaning the developed world, or say coalitions of democracies, have never tried to cut a big economy off before. We've never tried to just cut somebody out of globalization before, so a country that was integrated into the world in various ways. And now the world is treating Russia kind of like it treats Iran, not quite to the North Korea level of isolation, but to one that is similar to Iran, but without the decades of buildup to it, and without Russia being much more connected to the global economy. So we've seen a lot of massive economic damage to Russia. And on top of that, a lot of civil society reaction, where various businesses have left Russia, where governments have sanctioned both Russian individuals, various elites, Russian banks. Perhaps the biggest move is sanctioning the Russian central bank, which means that something like $600 billion worth of assets that were not denominated in rubles were frozen. So they're the Russian central bank holding, as all central banks do, assets in a variety of currencies. So they can't switch their dollars or euros or pounds or yen into or euros, did I say euros? Yes. Or yen into rubles, which means that that money is effectively frozen for them. We've also seen a big crackdown on the wealthy Russian elites that are connected to the Kremlin, known as the oligarchs. And you've probably seen reports of things like some really fancy yacht being frozen, or some accounts being closed. And I'm curious to see where that goes, because it is possible that that stays focused just on Russia, or possible that it turns into a larger global anti-corruption push. There is, however, no clear endpoint or evident goal of these sanctions, that it is a reaction, it's punishment. So usually with sanctions as a method of international policy, there is a clear demand, and the sanctions get imposed, and with the offer that the sanctions will be removed if the demand is met. So for example, with Iran, after the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that Iran was not in line with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the UN Security Council held a vote and agreed to sanction Iran, and a lot of countries started sanctioning Iran, including the United States and Europe, as well as Russia and China. And then they told Iran, okay, if you agree to new restrictions on your nuclear program and give up a lot of your nuclear material, then we'll remove the sanctions. So now, of course, you could agree, disagree with that policy on the merits, but it is something that has that clear goal. And it's not totally clear what the United States and other countries aim to get with this economic punishment of Russia. Is it something where if Russia stops the fighting in Ukraine, then the sanctions will go away? Is it something where the attack on Ukraine reveals that Putin is a big problem, one that we probably should have dealt with sooner and probably would have had to deal with anyway, and therefore the economic pressure is something to keep up? And it is not clear. Not only do I not know, I don't know if policymakers know. If Russia was aiming to damage NATO or to protect itself in NATO, this war has been an incredible failure. The war has given NATO a new sense of purpose. It has caused Europeans to raise defense spending, which is something that American presidents have been pressuring them to do, both parties, for decades. And the only thing that really seems to do it is a threat from Russia. They raised it again a little in 2014 when Russia took Crimea. And some formerly neutral countries, such as Finland and Sweden, have started working towards joining NATO. Additionally, Switzerland has joined on the banking regulations. Famously neutral Switzerland not only is not neutral here, but also is going into Swiss bank accounts and, famously secretive Swiss bank accounts and cracking down on dirty Russian money. So Russia's actions have effectively united Europe, perhaps more than they have in decades. Also, the reaction is aimed not just at Russia, but also about the future. So it is important from an American, European, Canadian, international perspective. You can add Japanese, South Korean, who are in on this too. It's important that this goes down in history as a failure, that there will be people in various governments, and not just in Russia in the future, but also think perhaps China thinking about whether or not to attack Taiwan. And they're going to have a conversation where somebody will bring up this conflict as an example. And we want them to say that, look, Russia tried aggression. You saw what happened. It was such a counterproductive disaster. It ended up really being a terrible mistake. We don't want to do that. It's too risky. As opposed to, oh, you saw what Russia did with Ukraine. Yeah, the world got upset about it for, a year or two. But then the temptation of the money of the big market brought them all back in. And, China's a much bigger market. They're more likely to come in here. So don't worry about it. They don't actually need it. So we needed to go down in history as a failure, not only militarily on the ground, but also in terms of global positioning and power. Here an idea of some of the weapons that Ukraine is using that are making a difference. This thing is called the TB2. It's a drone that is made by Turkey, and it is similar to the American Predator drone. That is the older model. The ones that, if you hear about the drone strikes, that's a drone known as the Reaper, which is also the Predator B, basically a bigger version like this. But this has been performing really well, that it has been firing missiles at a variety of Russian forces on the ground, including things like convoys that got stalled. And thus far, Russia has not been able to shoot them down, or at least not enough of them down, which is another example of poor military performance, because these things do not fly very fast. They're not especially maneuverable. They are designed to attack targets on the ground, not to fight things like other airplanes or anti-air missiles. These are perhaps the most significant weapons that the outside countries have given to the Ukrainians. This is an anti-tank missile. A lot of these are what's known as fire and forget weapons, which means that the missile hits the target itself. Somebody doesn't need to aim at it. It's not like shooting a gun where you would need to aim carefully to make sure that the bullet goes where you want it to go. You can fire kind of in the general direction of what you're shooting at, and it finds a heat signature on its own. And currently, with the latest shipment of U.S. weapons to Ukraine that was just authorized by Congress, I think this was today, the U.S. said that it thinks either currently or in the very near future that the Ukrainians will have about 10 anti-tank weapons to every one Russian tank. So a big part of the reason of why we have seen a lot of pictures of Russian vehicles and smoldering husks and turrets blown off tanks is these things. And these seem to be a force equalizer. Similarly, these as an anti-aircraft weapon, this thing is known as a MANPADS, which stands for Man Portable Air Defense System. And there are some videos around that show these knocking down Russian helicopters. And if a plane flies low, they can take out one of those too. Then finally on the weapons, this thing is called the Switchblade drone. This is known as a kamikaze weapon. It fires out of that tube that you see there, and its wings pop out. You can see it kind of in stages in the photograph. That's why they call it a switchblade, kind of like the knife with popping out. And the US just sent 300 more of these to the Ukrainians. And it carries a charge about the size of a grenade. It can fly around. It's from a pretty big distance, has a powerful camera. And so somebody can hide while they go fly, maybe look for, say, a tank or a concentration of Russian forces, and then they can crash it into it with a force that is similar to a rocket-propelled grenade. Finally, the last thing I'll talk about here is an interesting aspect of the conflict, I think, is information warfare. One reason that we thought that Russia was great at it, that a lot of discussions since, in particular, the evidence of Russian interference in the Brexit vote in the UK, in the 2016 US election, 2017 presidential election, among others, that they had a reputation for being very good at what's known as influence operations and shaping narratives and general techniques of information warfare. And I think that in looking at this, a lot of their effort hasn't worked, but that part of that is not so much that we overstated how strong they were, but also a lot of the world has adjusted to it. And these circumstances are really hard to spin. And on top of that, the Ukrainians are doing great at information warfare. They are succeeding really well. A lot of this comes from the president, from Volodymyr Zelensky, who was someone who was elected in 2018, I think 2018, 2017, one of those. And was someone who had never had political experience before. He played the Ukrainian president on a sitcom, that was kind of his path to the presidency. And at first, it looked like he was just way overwhelmed by the massive geopolitical forces that he suddenly found himself buffeted by. When he first got into office, when he got embroiled in the Ukraine scandal that caused the first Trump impeachment. And then where he, then between Putin and the United States, and then eventually attacked by Russia. So maybe he did not have the experience in geopolitics, but what he had tons of experience on was getting on TV and being the president. And he has done an impressive job of that, of both kind of rallying the Ukrainians and taunting the Russians and rallying foreign powers to his cause. The leadership, I think, is sometimes underrated, something important, though, not to underrate. And we have a good comparison for this, which is that the war in Afghanistan, that at the US withdrawal in Afghanistan, the Taliban was advancing on the capital of Kabul, and the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, packed his stuff in suitcases and fled the country. Whereas with Zelensky, as Russia was marching on the capital of Kyiv, he instead stayed. And I don't know what the war would have looked like without him leaving, but in terms of the Russian hope that the Ukrainian government was going to collapse, that probably made a big difference. In general, in information warfare, the kind of shorthand is you want to highlight heroes and martyrs, and Ukraine has also been doing that very well. Chances are that I'm assuming everyone here is in the United States, but even if you're not, if you're maybe in a different Western country, you are probably getting a somewhat skewed, more favorable to Ukrainians flood of, or well, maybe flood's not the word, feed of information. One of the things about that is Ukraine doing it on purpose. A lot of it is American kind of broader Western sympathy for Ukraine of who is going to be able to get information out, but also that the Ukrainians, now that I've said it, maybe you'll notice it a little more as you see this information, but a lot of cases it is who are the most sympathetic victims. So things like Russia bombed a maternity hospital and Ukraine makes sure to highlight that. Or hit civilians in these different places, or look at this, sympathetic figure suffering. And then at the same time, flipping that around with, look at these Ukrainian soldiers who just managed to, take down these bigger Russian forces. Or look at this Ukrainian grandma who is nobly kind of berating the Russian soldiers in town and telling them to go home. Russian propaganda has been almost absurdly false in that I gave you some of the examples of the attempts to justify the war. It seems like they told not only a lot of the Russian people, but also even their own soldiers that the war was going to be, that they were going to be, to use a American cliche, greeted as liberators, that they were going to be welcomed. A lot of Russian soldiers weren't even told that they were going to war. They were told it was an exercise, weren't told they were going to war until they were already across the border into Ukraine. And to some extent, it seems like with these justifications, almost like Russia's not really trying, like the things are so ridiculous that you couldn't believe them. But the style of propaganda is not really to convince people that are not receptive that a false thing is true. The effort here, the strategy, is to convince people who are receptive, who kind of want to support you, that give them something that they can support. And that applies not just to Russians, but also to sympathetic figures elsewhere, such as, for example, the Fox News host Tucker Carlson in the United States, who has made statements that at least the Russian government considers to be so beneficial to them that they often re-air his segments on Russian state television, with Russian subtitles, but on Russian state television. So it's to give people like him something to argue, and then also to make it where a lot of average people, the picture gets muddied, or they don't know what's going on, they get frustrated, maybe they check out. And in this case, the picture itself, the facts, are pretty clear and hard to muddy. But an important thing for Americans to keep in mind is that with this particular information warfare, Russia's biggest targets are Russian citizens. And after that, it is people in Asia, especially in India and China. The Chinese government, Indian government has tried to stay neutral, and probably as neutral as anybody has. And the reason for that, their relationship in Asia is complicated, and also Russia is their biggest arms supplier, ahead of the United States, and also sells them stuff the Americans won't. Whereas China had originally said something that was kind of pro-Russian, and then pretty quickly backed off to a more, once they saw things weren't going well, to a more neutral, we call for peace, trying to be non-committal. But a lot of Chinese state media is pro-Russian in that it is pushing a Russian-friendly narrative. So average Chinese are probably getting a more pro-Russia picture than the facts warrant, and certainly a more pro-Russia picture than Americans are getting. Okay, so that's what I prepared for everybody. And let me stop the share, and I look forward to your questions.
Nicholas, thank you so much. We've got a ton of questions in the chat and the Q&A already, but let's dive right in. You've talked about sanctions quite a bit, but I think there's still quite a few questions in our Q&A about that. So just kind of your thoughts on the current sanctions. How quickly can they really influence, the people of Russia and really become effective? And then where do we go from here? Are there additional sanctions that you see coming or that you would think would be beneficial to this?
So there are a couple of different ways to evaluate the sanctions. In one way, they are working very well, which is that and perhaps this is arguably this is the most important way, at least in the short term, which is that some Russian military industry has been unable to function properly. A big Russian tank maker, and they have pretty much only one that does the assembly, said that it can't build new tanks anymore because it used foreign components. A similar problem is that Russia likely does not have many long-range or medium-range precision-guided munitions, basically smart bombs. Pretty much all their bombs, or most of their bombs, are dumb. And those missiles, they only have so much, and they also can't get new ones of those because they rely on computer chips that are not produced domestically in Russia that they can't import anymore. So they will run out. There is, as big as the Russian military is, they can only sustain these sort of offensives for so long. It is very resource intensive. The troops get exhausted. They need a lot of new equipment. They need constantly replenished equipment, and they can't just keep making it. So in terms of the course of the war, that part has been very successful. In terms of isolating Russia and punishing the Russian economy, I think that's also been very successful in that the world is basically crashing the Russian economy, and they will likely end up with things like, say, defaulting on their international debt and cutting off from a lot of businesses, in that a company that was in Russia and then left Russia can't just go back very easily. One is maybe they would have some issue with the Russian government, if they were perhaps, I don't know if Russia was upset about it or didn't want it, but also there's additional political risk. It would be financial risk to be able to just, cause the money to actually spend to restore operations. And so all of that would be felt. And also things where average Russians, let's say, might not notice that, but Russia got kicked out of international soccer tournaments, that they got kicked out of the World Cup and the Euros, and their club teams got kicked out of things like the Champions League and the Europa League in Europe. And those are the sort of things where maybe you're an average Russian and you don't notice, say, some store is closed, or you're not in finance, so it's not like your bank account, your international bank accounts got frozen. But when your team isn't playing in the World Cup, yeah, you notice that, and you might ask why. But on the question of what will it ultimately do, I really don't know. And I think I'd even go so far as to say, if anybody tells you they know, that I would be wary of what they're saying, that it is something where it is impossible to know where it really goes, because nothing like this has ever been tried before. And it happens so fast, in part because the United States and other countries threatened it. And so then when Russia did the invasion anyway, then immediately the response was, well, since we threatened it, we have to then go and execute it, to carry it out, if nothing else, to make sure that future threats are taken more seriously. But also the the pressure on them is probably felt by, say, the regular populace more than anybody else. But I bet also a lot of the oligarchs and Putin himself are feeling some of these financial freezes around the world that, or things even like their, I don't know, daughter or mistress or something getting kicked out of a apartment or kicked out of some fancy prep school, that they're feeling that somewhat. But I would caution anybody against thinking that this is going to lead to the end of Putin or regime change in Russia. And the reason why is the oligarchs are so dependent on him. He has set up something that's almost like a mafia-like structure. If you want to think of Putin and the oligarchs, it's something like a combination of a intelligence agency, government, mafia, and gas station. And they are have so much more to lose without him than with him, that even if things get really bad for him, they probably know that they're screwed otherwise. And so they will likely stick by him. And it would be surprising, at least to me, if this results in Putin getting removed in power anytime soon. But the Russian economy is done for a while and is probably going to be cut off from the world for a foreseeable future. With implications of that, I really don't know. We'll have to see.
Nicholas, talk about the Russian citizens a little bit more. We've had a few questions about that, and somebody in the Q&A mentioned that polling, at least the Russians are saying that polling is showing that their citizens are in favor of this war. Obviously, those numbers can be, kind of conflated, and certainly folks are, I think, unwilling to speak out against Putin. But maybe just talk about their reaction to the war, and how legitimate you think these polls are that are coming out that are saying that the folks are still backing this war.
So the polls, I think we have to take with a grain of salt, and it's both because the people, where we don't know about the pollsters themselves in terms of the methodology of the polls, so can't evaluate it that way. And even if they are genuine and say high quality researchers and trying to be objective, both the pollsters themselves would be worried about the government, and respondents would be worried about saying the wrong thing at the moment. There have been a lot of arrests of protesters, of some of them that were doing nothing besides maybe standing there with a sign. There was one person who got arrested for standing with a blank placard, that this was their attempt to kind of get around restrictions of new laws against speaking out against the war. So it is hard to say. Now, with those caveats, I think it is probably accurate that a lot of the Russian population supports the war. Both we can see this in things like the Z symbol that has proliferated, and various actions by individual Russians that they get out onto social media that show that they support it. And a lot of them have a media diet that is showing them things like, that is pushing the lies about genocide, or about Russia trying to help innocent victims, or any variety of that, or about how just casting Russia as the victim of the story. Without knowing the specifics of what they think, I think probably the biggest divide seems to be between primarily age, and also to some extent kind of urban-rural. But think of it as the people who would get their information from outside of Russian state media versus the ones that get it primarily from Russian state media. And so older people, less educated people, and to some extent more rural people would have less access to information, in particular be on the internet less than younger people and people in cities. And so there is some evident divide there. But with Russia cracking down in various ways internally, the Putin government has gained even tighter control of the media in the country. And also, we've seen a lot of people flee Russia. So who would be the ones that are leaving? It's Putin critics. And it is to some extent a brain drain. It's people who see Russia having gone for, it was already fairly authoritarian, and now got decently more so, is approaching a totalitarian state. And so they got out ahead of that. And that means that there are fewer people who are Putin critics, who are opposed to the war, who are pro-democracy, that will be left in Russia. So the Russian population will probably shift a little to be more pro-war. And while it won't work on everybody, my guess is that a lot of Russian government efforts will be able to convince people that if they are, for example, starving or having trouble getting some sort of economic benefit, or even just want to see the Russian team in the World Cup, that the reason is because of foreigners being cruel to Russians, as opposed to because the Russian government started a unprovoked war of aggression.
Yeah, so Nicholas, talk a little bit about the strategy moving forward for Russia. We had a question come in. Does the fact that Putin has recently restated his primary objective to be the control of the Donbass region kind of acknowledge that a takeover of the entire country can't happen or likely won't happen? And is that his way of kind of reframing winning here, if you will?
Yes, that the best news, and we're talking about war where a lot of people are being killed every day. So best is a relative term, but the best news I thought out of the conflict since it started was when the Russian Ministry of Defense issued an official statement saying that phase one of their war plan was a success, and now they are shifting on to phase two, which is focusing on Donbas. And that I took as a big positive, because them saying that it was a success is their admission of failure, that they followed that up with military movements on the ground. So, I showed you the maps, and there are Ukrainian forces now in these towns, and there are satellite photos and other things that show that the Russian forces really are gone, that they have redeployed into the east. So that shows that even though Russia won't admit it, that they reluctantly have been forced to accept Ukrainian independence, at least to some extent, and are now trying to take control of areas where the pro-Russian separatists had been operating, where Russia had, say, more of a presence, and where there are, on balance, more Russian speakers and kind of ethnic Russians than there are in other parts of the country. So that, yeah, I took it as a big positive that they shifted. In terms of, though, their war aims now, what I don't know, so if that plan A was take over the whole country and get regime change, and plan B is try to take over Donbas, I'm not sure what plan C would be. So if Russia does manage to succeed in the Battle of Donbas, it's probably a pretty good chance that then they try to do peace negotiations, that then, they claim victory, say that they were always trying to protect the people there, that was the only thing they were ever really after, and stop. And partially the reason why I would guess that is because the Russian military is running out of capabilities, and that's part of the also reason why they shifted was they were running 4 or 5 offenses simultaneously, and have shifted to making that, I think, basically 2 or 3, depending on how you judge it. And that is easier to do, but they have cycled some forces that were fighting in Kyiv and other cities to go fight in Donbas. And that's also kind of a military 101. You don't want to do that unless you are really desperate, unless you have to, because troops need a bit of a break, that if they have been in combat and they've been, sleepless and hungry and cold, they're not in the best condition to then go and fight. And Ukraine seems to have a morale advantage by just fighting for their independence, by wanting it more, by a lot of the Russian soldiers being conscripts, that it's not clear how long Russia could sustain it. But going into Donbas, then maybe they can get something that they can, really save face and claim as a victory, especially that Putin can then turn around and tell the Russian military, look, see, it was worth it. I was right again, or, something along those lines, even though they know that he was after something more ambitious at first. But I don't know what plan C would be. And so if Ukraine manages to win, does at least win this battle, does Russia accept that and agree to end the war without really gaining anything? That, losing all those Russian soldiers and exposing their military as less powerful than people thought, and enduring all the economic problems and murdering a lot of Ukrainians for just sort of the status quo pre-war? Do they get somewhat desperate? Because at that point, maybe Putin would continue demanding concessions, but Ukraine would be in no mood to say yes and not feeling like they have to. This is perhaps the scenario of if I could see a nuclear strike, and I think that's very unlikely, to be cautious, but I can't say it's zero. And would Putin be so desperate that he would then, I don't know, like nuke Kyiv and say, if you don't surrender, I'm going to nuke another city? Maybe, probably not, but maybe. Try, something else, just firing on more Russian cities, or Ukrainian cities, and trying to kill more civilians until just finally, a la Syria or Chechnya, finally the Ukrainians quit. I don't know. But that is something that keeps me pretty nervous. So where the two outcomes are either Ukraine managed to win the Battle of Donbas, and then I don't know what Russia will do, but they're desperate, or Ukraine loses the Battle of Donbas, and both of those, I think, are concerning. So we will have to see. I think we'll probably know the answer to that within, I don't know, weeks. It's hard to say exactly how much, but the picture should become clearer within a couple of weeks.
Dr. Grossman, you said that you believe that nuclear warfare is unlikely, but not zero. Talk a little bit about chemical warfare and if you think that's a possibility that comes into play here, and at what point, if any, do you see the U.S. or NATO stepping in if those types of things start to happen, and would we step in if a nuclear strike were to take place, even though this is a non-NATO country?
So the first thing, just on a basic level, the United States is not obligated to defend Ukraine. The U.S. is obligated by treaty to defend all NATO countries, but does not have that agreement with Ukraine, and has worked to, meaning America has worked to honor its commitments and show various NATO countries, Poland and Estonia being two good examples of it, that the U.S. supports them, send a few more troops, conduct more exercises, and kind of take their defense seriously. That said, the possibility of a nuclear launch is maybe the only thing that I think could get the U.S. involved directly. Of both the U.S. military and the White House have, so the Biden administration, been very adamant about not sending U.S. troops. And I personally think that that is very much the right strategy, both because of the risk of escalation, but also because it might be a lifeline to Putin, that a lot of, say, the Russian military that doesn't really love the slaughtering innocent Ukrainians has been gearing up to fight NATO their entire careers. And this could create a rally around the flag effect that kind of gives Putin additional life. With chemical weapons, some of you may have seen some rumors that there was chemical weapons use. I'd really caution you on those, and I reacted to it almost right away of hesitation. And first, because the only source for it that I've seen is not credible, and everything, or at least maybe let's say questionable credibility, and everything else, everybody else that commented on it that I saw was citing that source or citing people who were referencing that source. If there was really a chemical attack, that's the sort of thing that leaves behind a lot of hard evidence. And I think it would have been, if it had happened already, we probably would have seen that evidence, similar to how we have seen evidence of, for example, Russian mass graves. With nuclear weapons, just all bets are off. There hasn't been a nuclear weapon used in war since the United States nuked Japan, and that was when the United States was the only nuclear power. So as long as there have been more than one nuclear power, nobody has ever used it in conflict. And if that happens, that would be a global crisis. And I'm not sure what the reaction would be, of where I think a lot of even the security people are in hoping that doesn't happen, because then the only two choices are either respond with a nuclear strike, which then risks escalation to nuclear war, or let a nuclear use slide, which then makes it a lot more thinkable in the future, which breaks the nuclear taboo against it. With chemicals specifically, various chemical weapons are a really nasty way to go, but it's not like people who die from poison gas are any, say, more dead than people who die from being exploded or shot, or things along those lines, or people that have serious injuries from them. So that chemical weapons alone, it does have a greater violation of additional international laws and of international norms, but I don't think that that would prompt a direct American intervention. And I also would not suggest a direct American intervention if such a thing would happen. But it would be more attacks on civilians, more brutality, more dismissal of international law and norms, and even things of laws of war that Russia, as brutal as they have been at times, have followed in the past.
So Nicholas, talk a little bit about the alleged war crimes. I know that that's been something in the news over the last couple of weeks. What, if anything, will be done about that? Is there a chance that something actually, comes to bear as a result of that? Will anyone actually be, taken to court, or what would be the process for that if that were to take place?
So war crimes are the label we give to actions that are outside the laws of war. So when I say laws of war, there is, there are a lot of sort of permissive actions when we go to war, where you can think of it like the rules change of really basic things like murder is illegal and thou shalt not kill suddenly becomes, okay, go kill. Now killing is allowed. And the attempts to try to control war via law, or for that matter, with philosophy and concepts like just war theory, are excuse me, things that are difficult to enforce, but part of the way that they try to make it work is by allowing a lot of really brutal things, a lot of killing, a lot of destruction, and that there are some things that are so wrong, that are so over the line, that they get this additional label war crimes. For the actions that Russia has done in Ukraine, that includes things like deliberately firing on civilian targets, not shooting at military targets and accidentally hitting civilians, or accepting some collateral damage that civilians in the area might get hurt, but deliberately attacking civilians. That one is illegal under the Geneva Conventions, with evidence of mass rape, of execution of civilians in cold blood, of torture, torture of prisoners. Those are all examples of war crimes, of things that go beyond battlefield fighting. And there is considerable evidence that Russia has done a lot of that. And in some ways it kind of set it up. And where what I mean by set it up is, think of it as they took a bunch of young men and lied to them, and then threw them into the middle of a war, and then in some places told them to just, okay, we're going to leave you here. You just control this town. And you took like, I don't know, 19, 20, year old, really, I don't know, boys, and control this town where we told you everyone was going to like you, but really everybody hates you, and you don't have much food, and you have, sort of nothing to do, and nobody's listening, and it's cold. And this is in no way an excuse of their actions, but it's the sort of thing that if the leaders did not want behavior like this, they would not have thrown their soldiers into that sort of situation. At minimum, they didn't care. Perhaps they even encouraged it. And given that this is what we've seen in various places that Russian forces were pushed out of, that means that there is probably a decent amount of it going on in places where Russian forces still are occupying Ukrainian territory. Unfortunately, I don't think much is going to happen as a result of this, that the international response would be things like war crimes charges or charges of crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. And there probably isn't anybody that can force Russia to hand people over or who are going to arrest Russians. So if anybody has a picture of some Russian generals or even Putin himself on trial in a way that, say, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia who oversaw and ordered ethnic cleansing in the war at the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. And people like him were put on trial, but he was much weaker. And I don't think there are the capacity to do that for a powerful state. So if there is going to be punishment for the war crimes, to some extent, it's going to be by Ukraine, that if they capture Russian soldiers, perhaps if they manage to win or at least survive, that maybe put some of these prisoners on trial for war crimes domestically. But beyond that, it would have to come from things like, say, sanctions. Unfortunately, this will probably be another in a fairly long list of state war crimes throughout history that go unpunished.
Dr. Grossman, we're coming up on the hour, but I think we've got time for maybe two more questions. So to kind of start to wrap us up here, do you believe that Ukraine will hold its independence as a result of this? And will they come out of this as an independent nation at the end?
Yes. And I think almost certainly yes. And that the reason why was the military government or military victories around Kyiv, of that first Zelensky not leaving, then the Ukrainian government and military holding together, and then their military success around Kyiv. Russia took its best shot. I don't think that they can, it's not like they have a bunch of reserves that they could then throw at Kyiv and actually make the government collapse. And they were also trying, this was less publicized, but things like Spetsnaz, that's a Russian special operations forces, basically they're Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, and mercenaries from a Russian private military corporation called the Wagner Group were in Kyiv trying to find Zelensky, and at least according to the Ukrainian government, that they thwarted 3 separate assassination attempts. So with that combination of thwarting those attempts and pushing the Russian military back, it looks like Ukraine will survive. What exactly they survive as, I don't know. And that depends on the war in Donbas. So they could survive as an independent state that doesn't have Crimea and doesn't have some territory in Donbas and maybe loses some more coastal territory, which leaves them weaker, both economically and militarily, but still independent and thriving as a closer member of the European Union, for example. But the question of whether Ukraine would be destroyed or conquered, I think that one's been answered by the battle on the ground. The question of what will Ukraine look like after this is done, that I don't know, and in part because it depends on military results that are unpredictable.
So along those lines, and I realize this is a very difficult question, and there's a lot to happen here to really answer this question, but if you had to speculate today, how do you see this ending? How do you see this coming to a conclusion in some way?
I mean, with all those caveats of that, the real answer to this is I don't know. I don't know. And really, when analysts do this, when you think of military or intelligence analysts do it, it's not that I think X is going to happen. It's X, Y, Z, and also while we're at it, A, B, and C are plausible scenarios, and D, I guess, maybe could happen, but is very unlikely. And then other things say are not especially likely. Just one example of where if you've heard reported in the media about how General Milley, chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that Kyiv was going to fall in 3 days. That's a good example of misreading the type of predicting that they do. That was at a closed door meeting in Congress, and almost certainly what he said is one possibility is Kyiv falling in 3 days, and another possibility is this, another possibility is that. And we think there's at least a serious risk of the government collapsing, but also of these other possibilities. And then the media just reports it as kind of worst case scenario, here's what could happen. Every instinct that I have, like kind of all my training is shouting out to give you multiple scenarios. But since you asked for one, at the risk of being wrong very soon, I think that the Ukrainians win or at least stalemate Russia in the Battle of Donbas. That the reason why I think that is because the problems of the Russian military and the advantages of the Ukrainian military, not equipment, not numbers, but things like morale and now a lot of fancy Western weapons. And there's also maybe greater cohesiveness, that those continue to be a major factor, that Russia cannot really get total control of the Donbas, and that then there is a pretty big, once that's militarily decided, pretty big diplomatic push to make where it goes basically back to where it started, but with Russia getting some sort of little thing that what we call an off-ramp, basically something where Putin can claim at least domestically that he won, or that it was a success, or that he gained something and it was worth it. And that is something where it's, it doesn't sit right with a lot of people because it is in essence somewhat rewarding somebody for some really terrible actions. But the reason why we look for things like that, we look to give off-ramps, it's not a favor to Putin, it's not a favor to them. It is a way to get out of the conflict, that if he is in a position where he thinks his own domestic power is in trouble, then who knows what he'll do. If he thinks that it's basically him or Ukraine, then maybe he does start thinking about nuclear weapons. And that's something we really want to avoid. So I'd say as a prediction, this will end with some sort of negotiated settlement, as most wars do. The terms of that negotiated settlement will have to be determined by facts on the ground. And I think that Ukraine manages to continue thwarting Russian military efforts to the point that at least Russia does not say, take all of Donbas and then manage to annex it into Russia. That something less than even what they currently have.
Dr. Grossman, thank you so much. We're at 5 after the hour. I want to be respectful of your calendar and everybody on the line here with us. So we will end there. I do apologize. We've got a ton of questions still in the Q&A and in the chat. So I apologize for those that we haven't been able to get to, but what a fascinating topic and certainly timely. So thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you all for joining us for another iteration of our speaker series. We do have another session coming up here in the very near future. We will have Provost Kangelaris, Andreas Kangelaris here from the university, joining us in May. You will be receiving some information on that in your emails here in the coming days and weeks. So certainly feel free to join us for that if you're interested. But again, thank you for all joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you again to Dr. Grossman. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you. Have a wonderful night.